Hello again. Um, Welcome back after a few minutes of break. I hope you're enjoying our conference. I certainly am very much enjoying it. Now we are ready for our executive spotlight session, which will be a dialogue between Arkel Giorgio and Susan Silbermann. And I will start with introducing Dr. Arkel Giorgio, who will then take her conversation on our executive spotlight. Dr. Arkel Giorgio is board certified in internal medicine, and she is the Chief Health Officer for Starkey Hearing Technologies. She's also a nationally recognized author and health reporter and medical expert for KSTP TV, the ABC affiliate in Minneapolis and St. Paul. In 2017, Dr. Giorgio published her first book, Healthcare Choices: 5 Steps to Getting the Medical Care You Want and Need, which is a book for consumers who want to have a voice in their healthcare decisions. Dr. Giorgio served as a senior executive and chief medical officer for United Health Group from 1995 to 2007, and she serves on several boards of directors, including Caring Bridge, and she's the chair for the board of Children's Minnesota Hospitals and Clinics. I'm also grateful personally and professionally, as Dr. Giorgio is my co-founder and co-lead with Professor Soumya Sen at the Carlson School on our University of Minnesota COVID-19 hospitalization tracking project, which we have launched over a weekend back in March 2020, and we have been running since together. We're also honored to have Dr. Giorgio serve as a longtime executive in residence at the Carlson School. Thank you, Arkel, for joining us, and thank you, Susan, for joining us.
My goodness, thank you, Pinar, for that wonderful introduction. And I just have to say that working with you and the team on that COVID hospitalization tracking project is one of the proudest moments that I've had in my career. So thank you so much for that and for this opportunity to do this executive spotlight. And I am thrilled and excited to have this conversation with you, Susan. I'm going to do a brief intro, but we're going to learn a lot more about you in the next 50 minutes or so. Until about a year ago, Susan Silbermann was at Pfizer. She had been there for 34 years in multiple executive roles. She started as a summer intern when she was getting her MBA and stayed for the duration. She's held positions in marketing and general management, business and commercial development in the US and globally. So we can't go through 34 years of that, but 2 of her most recent assignments that are so relevant to our conversation today are that she was the global president of Pfizer Vaccines. She was also the global president of Pfizer Emerging Markets, and she was responsible for 10,000 colleagues across 100 countries. So I was introduced to Susan through a mutual colleague, and after our first conversation, I kept referring back to what I learned from Susan Silbermann in many, many conversations. And when Pinar was saying, what guests should we have for an executive spotlight, I just thought that I would love to share the insights that you personally shared with me and more to this broader audience. So thank you so much, Susan, for joining us here.
Thank you, Arkel, and thank you to everyone organizing this conference. I've been listening since it started this morning, and certainly so many relevant topics and so many things to talk about the consumer's role in taking care of themselves and in the healthcare industry. And so many of the most recent speakers said they expect to see a lot of acceleration now. And I have to say, I can't agree with them more.
Cool. Well, we'll dive into that a little bit. So we're going to talk about COVID because, of course, you were in the thick of it. But I want to make it clear to the audience that while this is about COVID and the vaccine, of course it will be, because Susan Silbermann is from Pfizer. There really is an opportunity to learn from that about how to move forward in healthcare, how to drive innovation in healthcare. So the real focus today is lessons learned from COVID. And I want to start at December 2019. You're the global president of Pfizer's Emerging Markets, and you got a phone call. I don't know, maybe it was from your boss, Dr. Albert Bourla, and he said something was happening in China, and then you found yourself leading Pfizer's internal COVID-19 task force. So Susan, take us back to that moment. What was that like?
So it's true. It was December of 2019. And actually, we were sort of wrapping up operations for the year. Our international year at Pfizer started in early December. So the international teams were gearing up to the beginning of the year, whereas the domestic teams were winding down. And I was planning my, generally, part of my emerging markets responsibility was China. And I was planning my usual early in the year visit to China, because when you work with countries in Asia, you hit Chinese New Year usually sometime in early February. So if you wanted to get in and have a conversation before the first quarter was over, you went in January. So planning our trip in January, there's a little bit of rumbling in December about the virus. And I think for those of you that do remember, it was sort of towards the end of the year. But, my team and I got on a plane in right after the New Year, basically, and went to Beijing for about 5 days, and Wuhan is exploding. And the headlines are in the newspapers, and Pfizer has a research hub in Wuhan, so we had a lot of colleagues in Wuhan. And, I'm learning a little bit more about this every day. I come back, and it's actually in January that I get the call as we're starting to deal with things shutting down in China and the virus really spreading, and a lot of efforts being made by public health in China to contain the virus. And so I'm asked, because I'm the leader that manages all of Pfizer's pharmaceutical business in China, although I don't manage all of our facilities in China. I was asked to start this internal task force and put people on it to do something that I had done in the past, which is really crisis management. And it started there with the actions on trying to protect the health and well-being of those 10,000 colleagues, to keep manufacturing sites up and running. As I've said to many people, Arkel, during the pandemic, you realize that if you weren't responsible for putting the cap on the bottle, you could actually work from many different locations. But for those people that were putting the cap on the bottle or putting the tablet in the blister, they had to find a way to safely get to and from work and keep medicines and vaccine supply going. So spent a lot of time thinking about how to keep colleagues safe. And lo and behold, come February, I took my next trip to Indonesia and Singapore, and came back through Singapore, and the Ministry of Health in Singapore was already checking people. Had you been to China? What were you doing in China? Got back to the US, and nobody was taking any never mind of this. But as we all know, come March, the world really shifted for those of us on this side of the international dateline, when we had outbreaks in Italy and outbreaks in Europe, and they eventually came to the West Coast of the US, and the rest is the history that we're all living through.
Right. So Susan, I have a question. You said that you were doing crisis management, and was it at that time, were you thinking it was a business crisis because you had manufacturing to do, or did you think that it would be a pandemic, a health crisis? What was the mindset of you, of the company? What were you crisis managing? I know that it was the health of your employees, but was it bigger than that?
Well, it was a little bit bigger than that, in the sense that, we, as any big company, any company with global operations, had already lived through SARS 1, not the SARS 2 that we have now. And they've lived through MERS in the Middle East. They lived through the H1N1 crisis. I was running Latin America at the time. We had to shut down our operations in Mexico for several weeks. So I think everybody realized it wasn't going to be a short-term thing. But I don't know that anybody, until basically Italy exploded, was really convinced how global and deep the epidemic would be. And I know for a fact, even some of the most respected infectious disease leaders that I had the chance to work with at Pfizer thought this would go on for a while. But I think if you ask them honestly today, would we still be considering it a problem in parts of the world, maybe more than others? 2 years later, nobody would have expected. So yes, it was crisis management writ large. It was business operations disruption. Every big business has a business continuity plan, because you can have little things happen, like tornadoes and floods. They're not little, but they're usually not global. But I think the fact that this was going to hit us, and hit us hard, started to dawn on people come mid-March of 2020.
So in every good crisis, there's an opportunity. And the challenge is picking the right big bet. And while Pfizer has done a lot, including, of course, the vaccine, which we'll talk more about, and then now Paxlovid, et cetera. But early on, the big bet was on the vaccine. So did you immediately, meaning the larger you, see the opportunity to develop a vaccine, or were there other considerations about where to put such a huge investment? Maybe it would be a therapeutic. Can you talk a little bit about how that strategic decision, what that looked like?
Well, I think, as the company sort of grappled with the fact that this was going to get bigger and badder and deeper and broader over the course of the months ahead, given the industry that Pfizer is in, there was a call to action. And Pfizer's CEO, Albert Bourla, and his executive team really sat down with real intention on what are the different things that can be done. So, of course, there's always, you could rely on your core R&D expertise and develop something to help solve the crisis. But there were other things. Could you lend your expertise in supply chain? Could you lend your expertise in manufacturing to other companies? Could you really just think more broadly about how to get to support, how to work with a coalition of companies to get support to colleagues, even for simple things like deliveries of computers and delivery of other supplies that people needed to successfully work from home. Because you could tell people, take your things home because you may be working from home for a while. But when you said a while to people, they figured a couple of weeks, not a couple of months or a couple of years. So working from home policies, which many companies like Pfizer had a rough draft of, these things became very important. But I think the strategic decision, Arkell, to think about vaccines and eventually therapeutics really came out of the relationship that Pfizer Vaccines had with BioNTech, which is the partner that Pfizer decided to join up with years before COVID-19 to explore the mRNA technology in areas like influenza. So you remember, many of you know that flu vaccines are something that most people in the United States, at least, and in some parts of Europe and the rest of the world, think of as an annual activity to help keep us safe. And everybody knows that flu vaccines have some level of efficacy, but not the level of efficacy that people would want, because people do die every year from the flu, both vulnerable seniors as well as kids. And so the mRNA partnership started years before the COVID pandemic with Pfizer and BioNTech to really explore this new platform that BioNTech and others have been working on for literally, as the stories have come out, multiple years, even more than a decade, to try and harness this technology to come up with a easy to rapidly evolve vaccine. Not easy to produce, not easy to make, not even easy to design, but at least something that could be tailored to the pathogen that you were after, the viral or perhaps even bacterial, but in this case, viral pathogen you were after. So the strategic decision that Pfizer made was to deepen this partnership to include COVID. And the relationship that the head of Pfizer's vaccine R&D and had made with the BioNTech over the prior years are what drove this partnership to be quickly established and then quickly productive. The Paxlovid is a different story. It was an internal to Pfizer project that was actually developed during the SARS, I believe the SARS crisis, and then was put on the shelf because it didn't seem to need to go anywhere. And then as we discovered more about the coronavirus, this coronavirus, there was another strategic decision to start testing some of the antivirals that Pfizer had on the shelf, and lo and behold, this particular protease inhibitor looked like it was another key to unlock the door here. So I think Pfizer had a lot of great scientists, a lot of great supply chain and manufacturing people, a lot of just an enormous team. And a lot of stories have been told about it. I don't want to repeat them here, but it does take an army, and Pfizer threw everything at it. And Albert and others pushed very hard, and just nobody took no for an answer. It was a taboo word for a very long time.
You know, in the middle of a build or buy, in the middle of a crisis, when you have a build or buy or build or partner decision, the tendency is to go internal, right? Because that's safe and that's what you know. So it was a really bold decision, even though you already had a partnership with BioNTech, that you went that path. So really a remarkable next step. So in addition to the partnership that you had with other company, I'm wondering how much collaboration there was in the pharmaceutical world overall with Moderna, with FDA and the federal government, with other manufacturers who were using different platforms. You know, it's very insular, as you know better than I do, but how much was happening behind the scenes to really move this development forward?
Well, there are a number of fora that R&D leads, business leads, scientific leads, basic biology, chemistry, manufacturing leads get together to discuss different issues. There are a number of organizations like CEPI, for example, which is the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness, that was set up also many years, well, I'd say many, but several years ago, to try and anticipate some of these viruses that plague us in different parts of the world, but that could, in the blink of an eye, become a much bigger issue. And so those were probably the fora where some of these discussions were happening. And I think in the beginning, nobody knew what platform was going to work or was going to work best. And so everybody was happy to see there were different people going in different directions. And I think people were going in the directions that they knew, because I think the tendency, as you said, to go internal wasn't going to help us really come together as a scientific and an R&D based industry to really help solve the world's problems. So I'm not privy to some of those. I was never privy to some of those conversations, but the community of both anti-infective and then the community of vaccine players is very small. It's much smaller than people realize, and everybody knows each other. And everybody was willing to share as much information as they could to help find this. I mean, the genetic sequencing of the virus was released by the Chinese lab in Wuhan, right early in the pandemic, or when it was still an epidemic, I guess, in China. And that was what led a lot of these companies to start to look at that gene sequence and trying to figure out what platforms might work. So I think all the big R&D based manufacturing companies for vaccines gave it a shot, no pun intended. Not everyone made it to the finish line, but everybody published their results and shared and learned, because what I think people are realizing now is that this is really an opportunity to drive forward the next generation of pandemic preparedness, which I think, even though a lot of people think the world was on its back foot for this, I think there was a lot of stuff that had happened, even if it had happened quietly. And I sort of want to refer to what was said earlier this morning in the conference, the 4 C's that I think where Bach was created on. I think it's convene, convene, collaborate, co-create, and communicate. I think those were the C's, if I remember, something like that.
Yep, convene, conduct.
Yep, co-create, and communicate.
Yes,
and I do think that if you trace the history of what happened during this crisis, that's exactly what happened. There was a lot of convening. There was a lot of conducting of discussions, clinical trials, debates. I mean, look at what you guys accomplished with the hospital tracker. I mean, there are just so many things that this pandemic forced us to sit down around the same table and put the problem in the center and take off the hats of the organizations that we belong to.
You know, I had an interesting conversation, or I was in an interesting presentation with the individuals that were responsible for the Johns Hopkins COVID tracking site. And of course, they shared all of their data to the world so that it could be analyzed and solutions could be, insights could turn into solutions. But they did filter every request for data to make sure that they understood what research would be done with that data. And they inventoried it so that if somebody in one university was working on the same project, they made those 2 groups work together. And that level of collaboration, I truly hope is something that we've learned the benefit of and continue to do moving forward. I'm going to switch gears a little bit. it's still about COVID, but there are, in addition to collaboration, there have been some other outstanding accomplishments. One being that this vaccine, we say that it took, less than a year to develop, compared to the 10 plus years that it usually takes to develop a vaccine. But I have a love-hate reaction to that accomplishment, because it almost diminishes 40 years of research that went into the mRNA platform development. And maybe even more important than that, the speed seems to have been a key driver of undermining public trust, or at least an excuse for undermining public trust. So my question to you is, how would you frame the timeline? Would you say it was warp speed, or would you frame it differently?
I totally agree with what you just said. I think the speed with which this vaccine went from start to finish really diminishes the decades of work behind it. You didn't get an electric car just because somebody looked at a toaster. I mean, there have been years of combustion engines and hybrid engines and cars. It's the same kind of thing. Like, an electric car didn't just appear. The same thing, this vaccine didn't just appear. People feel like it did. I would frame the timeline as, normally when you're not in a hurry, and one can argue that every disease people should be in a hurry, because if you are afflicted with that disease, you want people to be in a hurry to help you live with it, or God forbid, cure it and get rid of it, right? So, but let's say that there was a rush to this because of how rapidly it was spreading, and how impossible the world was going to be to navigate if we couldn't come up with some vaccines, not a vaccine, but vaccines, and hopefully also therapeutics, not therapeutic. I think that I'd frame this as, instead of cutting corners, people are like, oh, you cut corners. I'm like, no, nobody cut a corner, but they sped around the corners. They maybe, how you slow down at a stop sign and you come to a stop for like a nanosecond and then you turn right? That's sort of the way I would describe it. You just went around the corner. You checked in with your safety data. You checked in to make sure nothing untoward was happening to the subjects in your clinical programs, but you were writing up the results as the results were coming out. You don't sit down to write a book from chapter 1 to chapter 20 in one fell swoop. You write chapter 1, then you write chapter 2, then you revise chapter 1. So all of the things that normally in the course of R&D are done sequentially, here they were being done almost simultaneously. Like, there was no daylight between step 1 and step 2. There was a minute, there was a nanosecond. There was that brief moment that you touch the brakes, make sure no one is coming, and you turn. So I think you have to think of it not as reckless, but as being cautiously optimistic that every time you got a positive signal, you could go a little bit faster around the next corner because the world was waiting.
It sounds to me like startup mentality, right? That's how startups work. That's how innovation happens.
And the good news is, for the companies that are willing to do it, you throw a lot of money at it. Mm-hmm. And I think Pfizer's CFO and CEO and leaders have said on more than one occasion how many tens of millions, hundreds of millions of dollars would have been lost in a blink if at any step during the way it had failed. And the same thing is true for a startup. You're right. Working with a few small companies now, I can see exactly that point.
So I wish that that no corners were cut. We just sped around we just went around the corners a little faster, was better understood by the public, because, as I referenced earlier, we've had a lot of issues around trust among consumers. So I'm wondering, from your perspective, was all or most of the distrust due to the politicization that occurred, or do you think that there were other factors? What are your thoughts on that?
I mean, I think the politicization had a huge role to play. I don't think there was nearly as much mistrust in the 50s and 60s and 70s of the polio vaccine as there was as there is still today of the COVID vaccines. People didn't understand any more about vaccine production or delivery. They actually, a lot less than they probably do today, because it's been explained over and over again. but there was a lot of politicization around it. And I just don't think that happened if you look back to things like polio, even if you look back to the early development of flu vaccines and the use of flu vaccines. There's never really been a politicization of flu vaccines. But I also think there's another piece, and I was surprised. I don't think I heard it mentioned this morning as in the other speakers talking about the rise of the consumer. I think it was hinted at, but there's a word that I've used a lot, which is health literacy. I think people just, they don't understand it. They haven't had it explained to them by people they trust. You know, there's a lot of work that was done to bring vaccines to places, and this was done before COVID, bring vaccines and vaccination centers to places that people gathered as a community, that people had trusted elders or trusted community leaders that would explain it to them. It's why you saw a big change in a lot of the public service announcements around COVID vaccines, to have people on the screen that look like you, that talk like you, that come from where you come from, that can explain why they're deciding to give the vaccine to their teenagers, or why they're deciding to go get tested, or why they're deciding that wearing a mask is a good idea. So I think there's just been so much that we still haven't cracked the code on health literacy that I think played right into the hands of this politicization that hasn't helped. I've heard some of the best speakers I've heard talk about COVID and COVID vaccines and COVID testing and the antivirals, the treatments, the monoclonal antibodies, are people that put it in what I call layman's terms. It's why I love to use analogies when I talk about science, because I don't think people understand science for science unless you're a real scientist. And I think people want to understand it. So use an analogy that people can envision. I think the new administration's lead for COVID, Dr. Shah, talked about using a mask like you use an umbrella. I've told that story. I wish you were listening today, because I think it's the best analogy I've heard.
Could you repeat that? Because I didn't hear it. Ashish Jha's awesome. He's awesome.
He talked about, we can understand how to use a mask if we think about when we take an umbrella. We take an umbrella when we think it's going to rain and we want to stay dry. We don't necessarily put it up if it's a sunny day. So if we had a better system, and I think the CDC is trying to develop one that could predict, like the Weather Channel predicts the allergy risk in your area. If you have the Weather Channel app on your phones, the CDC wants to do something where they can predict the COVID risk in your area. And that's the day you wear your mask, or you take your mask if you're going indoors that day or that week. When you see COVID cases rising, you mask up, just like you carry your umbrella when you think it's going to rain. I just think it's a perfect analogy. I don't need to understand COVID. I just need to understand when it's going to rain.
Yeah, that's really great. And he's great. I think he's going to be really successful in that role. So I was going to ask you about, so how do we restore the trust? And so you brought up health literacy, bringing people, making therapeutics available in environments that people trust. What role do healthcare professionals have in driving trust in effective treatments, whether it's vaccines or something else?
A ton. They always have. They always have. When you did trust tests and trust, Edelman does an annual trust barometer, healthcare professionals were always very high up on the list. The most important thing is for them to feel comfortable and to feel educated. And some of the things about the speed, I think, of the development of especially the mRNA-based vaccines, which are brand new to the world, that probably caught a lot of healthcare professionals flat-footed, because they didn't have the chance to learn as much about it as they might have wanted to. So that may have been where some of the distrust came from. Because if you trust your physician or your pharmacist and you ask them a simple question, how does it work? What's it really doing to my DNA? If no one's explained to you that an mRNA vaccine is like inserting the code into a 3D printer and it's telling your body what to do, it's not changing your body, it's a code, and it's telling your body, make this protein so that if you get the virus will then, your body will do what it's meant to do, which was thwart off the infection, because the code has told it to build the protein that will cause the antibodies to fend off the virus. It's pretty cool and it's pretty simple, but unless you've been told how to explain it, and that's my way of explaining it, but unless you've been told how to explain it, you're a little flat-footed. And then what does your patient say? Oh, okay, well, if you don't understand it, Dr. Georgiou, why should I get it? Well, you should get it because I say so. I mean, that sometimes it works for some people, but it doesn't work for everybody.
It's a really interesting perspective because I know how long it took for me to do the research to understand how it worked so that I could do my segments on it on
Yeah.
KSTP. So I can imagine how busy physicians who were on the ground dealing with the crisis certainly didn't have time to do that themselves. I'm going to pivot a little bit more.
Mhm.
Pharmaceutical companies invest a ton of time and money in branding, naming and branding their products. But the Pfizer vaccine got launched, of course, with no name. And it was only 9 months later in August that it got its name Comirnaty. I hope I'm saying it correctly.
Mhm.
And frankly, it's still called the Pfizer vaccine. We just got our booster with my husband last week, and it's still listed as the Pfizer vaccine or the Moderna vaccine. So you had a really interesting story about the naming process and the impact on the company. I'm wondering if you'd share that.
Sure. I mean, naming any product, whether it's a pharmaceutical or a consumer good, there is a little bit of a science to it, and there's a little bit of a process to it to make sure that the name is pronounceable, the name is easily able to be spelled, and that it can't be confused with other products in the marketplace, especially when it comes to pharmaceuticals. There's a pretty strong rule that's held by the FDA so that doctors don't get things mixed up, or pharmacists don't get things mixed up, and people get the wrong medicine. Vaccines are a little different. Vaccines tend to have names that nobody really remembers because there are not a lot of them. There's very hard to get confused. And of course, the way the pandemic started, it had nothing to do with the name of the vaccines. And I think I can still count on one hand the number of times I've seen the name of any of the COVID vaccines printed that is the leading part of it. Like, nobody knows people don't remember who makes a lot of iconic brands in the pharmaceutical space, but they do remember the brand names. I think for the vaccine, it's probably going to be a long time. So the name Comirnaty actually came out of a mashup of mRNA, so the mer part, I guess, the mRNA part, and community, because that's really what people wanted to. They wanted to help through this new mRNA technology bring communities back together, because people were really suffering, being virtual all the time, being isolated in their homes, not seeing family, not seeing friends, and so it was a tough one because there weren't a lot of names available that allowed that combination of letters and sounds and feels, and they wanted it to be something that could be used around the world. And so it took a little bit of time to come up with it, but that's how they came up with it.
But one of the things you had shared with me was the incredible value that Pfizer got from not having a name.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, you're right.
No, that's okay. That's okay.
That's very true. I think that Pfizer has been in vaccines for a couple of decades now, and really wanted to make sure that it was important that they knew that it was a company that knew vaccines, that was actually in it. And so the Pfizer vaccine became sort of a mantra for a lot of people. And when I retired after 30 some odd years, one of the things I said to a lot of friends and colleagues, I said, when I started at Pfizer, when I was a summer intern and I was telling people where I worked, they said, Pfizer, or that Pfister, is that company that makes faucets? I'm like, no, it's Pfizer. It's a company that makes medicines. And I had to spell it over and over again. Now, whoever I talk to about whatever I'm doing in my post Pfizer years, everybody knows how to spell it. Everybody knows where it is. Most people know the name of the CEO, which I find fascinating, because most people would never know the names of the CEOs of any pharmaceutical company, but certainly Albert has done a great job sort of putting Pfizer out there and leading the challenge to make sure that we do this and do it the right way. But nobody doesn't know how to spell Pfizer anymore. Yeah. You really have to be under a rock.
So as you advise smaller companies, because any company is probably smaller than Pfizer, most of them, does it make you rethink the value on branding and naming? And you got so much value by not naming, well, before you named it. Does it make you rethink that investment? Like Tesla, right? Didn't spend a lot of time on the marketing and all that. What do you think?
I think certainly branding has a place, because it's how we remember a lot of things. I mean, like I said, you don't remember who made Pampers, but you remember Pampers. You don't remember who made Dove, but you probably have it in every bathroom in your house. And so I think, to some extent, most people probably don't remember that Pfizer is the one that introduced Viagra, but boy, Viagra used to be more well-known than Pfizer until I think COVID came along. Right. So I think there is an importance. I think you can overemphasize it sometimes. And I think that's where, there's a fine line to walk. And I think there's a change in the way people look at things, and what people spend money on. I think one of the last speakers, Janali from Walmart, said she hoped this country would stop spending so much on wasted healthcare and start spending more on education. I love that. I wrote it down. I thought it was a great way of looking at things, and I 100% agree with her. I think companies have to be careful how much they spend on branding. I don't think they can avoid it, but I think especially smaller companies, you got to get the product right before you worry about getting the name right.
Exactly. I'm going to switch again to another discipline that was very impacted in terms of rethinking how it's done. And that's supply chain management, which Carlson has such a strong reputation in. And so I'm wondering if you talked a little bit about it before, that there was sort of sequential parallel process versus sequential. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that.
Well, I mean, one of the things that I think was the hallmark of the beginning of really putting a stake in the ground to try and develop a vaccine for COVID at Pfizer was the fact that as soon as the decision was made, and the thought about how many hundreds of millions of doses would be needed, even before anybody knew how many micrograms was going to be in the vial, Pfizer had to go out and purchase vials. Normally you wouldn't do that. You wouldn't scale up that fast your supply chain because you have inventory, which generally speaking from an operations management perspective is a big no-no. You want it just in time, not hanging out, waiting to be used. And two, how big of a vial? You want it that big? You want it that big? Is it going to be this kind of a stopper or that kind of a stopper? The team sat down and had to make their best estimate on how big they needed to be, how many doses could fit in the vial. That, multi-dose vials were something that was very comfortable for emerging markets, not so comfortable for US and Europe, but we were going to think about multi-dose vials. So a huge investment was made in glass and buying vials. So those are the kind of things that you think about differently, and you had to do it or you knew you wouldn't be ready. So that was I think that's one key hallmark of the change in supply chain.
Yeah, absolutely. We're going to have to wrap up in a little bit, but I want to make sure that we don't just focus on what you did, but what you're doing. And after 34 years, what does this new chapter look like?
Thanks, Arkell. Yeah, it was an interesting time to decide to take my leave, but I think what I had realized is I had done so many things, and I really wanted to use some of that knowledge to help other parts of the world, if you will, get better at what they needed to do. So I'm a big advocate of diversity, equity, inclusion. I wanted to do some mentoring. And I also was very intrigued throughout my last couple of years at Pfizer of joining the boards of other companies. So I'm happy to say I've joined the board of 2 small startup companies. And I'm also on the board of a larger nonprofit that's actually working on vaccine platforms to solve some of these potentially dangerous diseases, as well as it's called IAVI. It started working on an AIDS vaccine, which it's still working on, but it's now expanded well beyond that. And I'm looking to continue to do board service, continue to do mentoring. I'd like to join an organization perhaps that is outside of healthcare that could take advantage of some of my international experience, having worked all over the world and run large organizations and done obviously crisis management, know a little bit about R&D, regulation, supply chain. But as I say to people, I'm as busy as I want to be. I'm also happy to spend time with my family and our little dogs, who I'm surprised haven't made an appearance during this, but they're quietly sleeping.
Mine either. Mine's sitting here quietly.
Oh no, she's right behind you in the chair. I can see her. But mine are sitting here quietly too, sleeping in the bed down by my feet. So yeah, it's been a great experience so far in about a year now that I've been out of my Pfizer role, and I just look forward to continue to contribute even to forum like this one. So thanks for the question, Arkel. Appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And we want to thank you for everything that you've done over so many years. You've touched the world in ways that we don't realize, and probably you don't even realize, with all of your service all over the world, and certainly within the last several years. So thank you so much, and for sharing some of what that was like to those of us who are watching from the outside and just admiring. So we really, really appreciate it, and appreciate you sharing that here with us at Convene today.
Thank you very much. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Pinar, I'll hand it back to you.
Thank you, Susan, and thank you, Arkel, for this conversation. We are going to take a little bit of a break now until 10:40 before we start our new panel, Enhancing the Consumer Experience in Healthcare. And Susan, it was so wonderful to hear about your journey, and I can't wait to hear what more you will keep on bringing to our healthcare system and our community. Thank you so much.
Most welcome, Pinar. Thanks for having me today.